I've never been much of a traveler. I like my own bed, my own kitchen, my own routine, and I've never really understood people who chase new places every year like it's some kind of hobby they need to keep feeding. My wife Dana is the opposite of me in almost every way that matters. She grew up moving constantly as a kid, different states, sometimes different countries depending on where her dad's job sent them, and she says staying in one place too long makes her feel restless in a way she can't quite explain. So every year, as a kind of compromise, I let her plan one trip and I try my best not to complain the whole time. Last October, she found a cabin listing about 3 hours from us, up in the mountains outside Asheville. It was a converted hunting cabin, wraparound porch, a listing description that used the word secluded like it was a selling point instead of a warning. Only one review on the whole listing, 5 stars, 1 word. Peaceful. I should have thought harder about why a place that nice had exactly 1 review and nothing else. We got there early afternoon, and instead of just texting us a door code the way every other rental we've used has done, the owner met us at the gate himself. Older guy, maybe 60, quiet in a way that felt practiced rather than shy. Told us his name was Purcell and that he lived close by if we ever needed anything during the stay. Dana asked how close. He just said, "Close enough," and smiled in this way that didn't really make it to his eyes. He walked us through the place himself, showed us where the breaker box was, told us the well water was safe to drink even though it smelled a little like sulfur the first few seconds it ran. Before he left, he told us one more thing that I brushed off at the time. He said if we ever heard anything outside at night, not to go looking for it, just to leave the porch light on and it would move along. Dana asked him what he meant by that. He just said, "Wildlife gets curious up here," and got in his truck. We laughed about it once we were inside unpacking. Mountain folks, we said to each other, just being neighborly in their own particular way. The first night was completely normal. We grilled dinner on the little porch grill, sat outside watching the stars for a while since there was almost no light pollution to speak of, and went to bed around 11. I woke up around 2 in the morning because Dana was sitting bolt upright in bed, completely still, staring at the window. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, very quietly, that something was standing outside. I told her it was probably a deer. We get them wandering through our own backyard at home all the time. She said it wasn't a deer. She said it was standing upright and it was tall. Taller than any deer has any business being, and it hadn't moved the entire time she'd been watching it. I got up and looked myself, and saw nothing but the dark shapes of trees. I told her to try to get some sleep. Neither of us really managed it. In the morning, I found boot prints pressed into the mud directly under that same window. Not deer tracks, not anything with hooves. Boot prints, and close enough together in the same spot that whoever left them had been standing there a good while, not just passing through on their way somewhere else. Dana suggested maybe it was Purcell, checking on the property like landlords sometimes do. I actually walked down the gravel road in the direction he'd pointed when he said he lived close by, and there was nothing there. No driveway cut into the trees, no mailbox, no rooftop visible through the branches. Just more woods going on for as far as I could see in either direction. I stood there for a minute, feeling a little foolish, then turned around and walked back. We almost left that same day. I talked us out of it, because we'd already paid in full for 4 nights, and I didn't want to eat that cost over what I kept telling myself was probably nothing at all. That decision is one I still think about more than I'd like to admit. Dana wanted to at least drive somewhere for the afternoon, get off the property for a while, so we did. We found a little diner in the closest town and ate lunch, and for a couple of hours everything felt normal again. On the drive back, Dana asked if I'd noticed Purcell's truck when we pulled in. I said I hadn't been looking. She said she thought she'd seen it parked just off the main road, engine off, nobody visible inside, about a quarter mile before our turnoff. I told her it was probably somebody else entirely. There's no shortage of old trucks on mountain roads. That second night, around midnight, we both heard someone try the front door handle. Not a knock, not even a rattle from wind. A slow, deliberate test of the handle, like whoever was on the other side wanted to know exactly how much it would give before they committed to anything further. I grabbed the fireplace poker off its little stand and stood by that door for what felt like 10 full minutes, just listening to my own heartbeat. Eventually the sound stopped completely. When I finally worked up the nerve to look out the window next to the door, the porch was empty. But the rocking chair Dana had left facing out toward the yard that morning was now turned to face the door instead, angled like something had been sitting in it, watching the house from the outside in. Neither of us slept much after that. Around 4 in the morning, I heard something else, fainter this time, coming from somewhere inside the walls rather than outside them. A slow dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled along a floor joist just above the ceiling or just below the floorboards. I honestly couldn't tell which. I told myself it was old pipes settling. I've told myself a lot of things over the years that I didn't fully believe even while I was saying them. At one point, the sound stopped directly above where Dana was lying and stayed stopped for close to a minute before continuing on toward the far end of the cabin. I didn't tell her that part until we were already home. The next morning, we drove into the nearest town, about 25 minutes of tight switchbacks, mostly just to get cell service back and clear our heads somewhere that wasn't that cabin. I asked the woman working the counter at the gas station if she knew anything about the cabins up near where we were staying. She got quiet in a very specific way, the kind of quiet that tells you someone's already deciding how much to say. She asked if we were staying with Purcell. I told her I guessed so. She asked, carefully, if he'd rented the place to us himself directly, or if it had just come through the online listing. I told her he'd met us at the gate in person. She didn't answer that part directly. What she told me instead was that the man who used to actually own that cabin had passed away a long time back, and that his family had never gotten around to selling the property, tied up in some kind of legal mess for years. She said nobody in town was entirely sure who'd been renting the place out under his name ever since. When I pushed a little further and asked if she'd ever heard anything specific about people staying up there, she glanced toward the back of the store where a man was stocking shelves, lowered her voice, and said only that a couple who'd stayed there 2 summers back had come into the station in the middle of the night asking to use the phone, wouldn't say why, and never came back to get gas again even though they still had 2 more days paid for. Then she rang up my gas, told me to have a nice day, and turned to help the next customer, in a way that made it pretty clear she'd already said more than she'd meant to. I didn't repeat all of that to Dana right away. I just told her we were leaving that night. Didn't matter what it cost us or what was already paid. We packed while there was still daylight left, on purpose, because neither of us wanted to be loading a car in the dark up there anymore. While we were carrying bags out, Dana went back inside for her phone charger, and I heard her scream from the bedroom. I ran in and found her standing at the closet, pointing, and hanging neatly on a hook inside was the exact shirt she'd worn, our very first night there. The same one she swore up and down she'd already folded and packed into her suitcase that same morning, hours before. We checked the rest of the suitcase right there on the bed. Nothing else had been touched. Just the one shirt, taken out, hung up, like whoever did it wanted us to notice specifically that one. We didn't stop the car until we hit the interstate on-ramp, engine running the whole time we loaded the last bag, doors locked before either of us was even fully seated. About 20 minutes down the highway, Dana's phone buzzed with a text from a number neither of us recognized. 2 words. Come back. We didn't respond. I called the rental platform from a gas station about an hour further down the road and reported everything. The boot prints, the door handle, the chair, the shirt, even the text, though I had no way to prove where it came from. About 2 weeks later, I got a short email back saying the listing had been removed for violating platform policy, with no further explanation offered beyond that single sentence. Out of a curiosity I probably shouldn't have indulged, I looked up the property records myself once we were home. The gas station woman turned out to be exactly right. That cabin has been sitting in probate for going on 11 years now, technically owned by nobody currently living, tied up between a handful of distant relatives who apparently can't agree on what to do with it. I found the public court filing dry and legal and boring in every way except for one line buried in it. A mention that the estate's lawyer had petitioned the court twice to have the locks changed on the property after unauthorized occupancy was reported by a neighboring landowner, both times with no resolution noted in the file. I still don't know who met us at that gate calling himself Purcell. I don't know who moved that rocking chair, or who let themselves in with a key well enough to hang a shirt back on a hanger after we'd already packed it away in a zipped suitcase. What I do know, and what still keeps me up some nights, is that whoever it was clearly had a key of their own and somehow already knew exactly which 4 nights we'd booked before we had ever told a single other person ourselves. I spent 5 summers working as a counselor at a church camp tucked into a hollow outside a town so small it doesn't even have its own zip code, just a shared one with the county seat 20 minutes down the road. Out of every one of those summers, there's exactly one I don't talk about anymore, not even at reunions with the other former counselors, because every single time I've brought it up over the years, somebody in the group gets quiet in a way that makes me wish I'd just kept it to myself. The camp had 16 cabins total, but cabin 14 never actually got used, not in all the years I worked there before that summer. It sat at the far edge of the property, closest to where the tree line thickened into real woods, and the maintenance staff kept it locked year-round, officially, for insurance reasons, which is exactly the kind of vague answer that satisfies nobody, but that everybody just quietly accepts anyway, because pushing harder never seems worth the trouble. I remember asking about it my very first summer, half joking, and getting the same flat non-answer from 3 different staff members in a row, which in hindsight should have told me something. That particular July, we ended up short-staffed and had an overflow group of 8 boys, all around 12 years old, with no cabin left available except 14. I got assigned there along with another counselor named Deacon, who I'd worked with for 2 summers by that point and trusted completely. We spent an afternoon airing the place out, sweeping the floors, wiping down the bunks. Honestly, it just looked like any other old cabin on the property. Dusty rafters, slightly musty smell, nothing that struck either of us as wrong at the time, other than maybe how quiet it felt compared to the other cabins, even with the windows open and birds going in the trees right outside. The first 2 nights were completely uneventful. On the 3rd night, one of the boys, a kid named Miles who'd been quiet and a little anxious the whole session, came and found me after lights out and said he couldn't sleep because somebody kept walking past his bunk. I figured it was probably one of the other campers sneaking off to the bathroom and told him as much. He shook his head and said no. This was different, because whoever it was had counted the beds out loud while they walked past, like they were checking who was there and who wasn't. He said the voice was low, almost a mumble, and that it had stopped right at the foot of his own bunk longer than any of the others before moving on. I told him it was probably just a half-dream, the kind you get right on the edge of falling asleep, and I walked him back to his bunk myself just to be sure. I counted heads before I left the cabin that night out of habit more than anything. 8 boys, 8 bunks, everyone exactly where they should be, nothing out of place anywhere in the room. I stood in the doorway a moment longer than I needed to before heading back to my own bed, telling myself it was nothing. Around 1 in the morning, Deacon radioed me on the camp channel and told me to get to 14 right away, voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him before. When I got there, all 8 boys were sitting together on the floor in the middle of the room, huddled close, refusing to go anywhere near their own bunks. Deacon told me they'd all reported the same thing, that someone had come into the cabin and stood at the far end of the room without saying a word, stood there for what felt like a long time, and then simply walked back out. One of the boys, not Miles this time, said the figure had been unusually tall enough that its head had come close to brushing the ceiling beams, and that it had been counting under its breath the whole time it stood there, same as what Miles had described the night before. I asked Deacon if he'd checked outside for footprints or any sign of somebody nearby. He said there was nothing out there at all, and then he told me the part that stuck with me every single day since. The door was still hooked shut from the inside, exactly the way we'd left it. That detail matters more than it might sound like at first. It was a simple hook-and-eye latch, the kind you can only fasten from inside the room itself. If that latch was still hooked when Deacon checked it, that meant nobody had physically come through that door and gone back out, not without somebody hooking it shut again behind themselves afterward, which made even less sense than the alternative. We checked every window too. All of them latched from the inside, none of the screens torn or removed. We moved all 8 boys to the mess hall for the rest of that night and reported everything to the camp director first thing in the morning. He didn't look surprised by any of it, which honestly unsettled me more than if he had been. Pulling us aside where the kids couldn't overhear, he told us that a counselor had died in that specific cabin decades earlier, well before his own time running the place, and that it had mostly just been used for storage in the years since. I asked him, pretty directly, why nobody had told us any of that before we put 8 children in there to sleep. He didn't really have an answer for that part. What he did tell us was that in the 15 years he'd personally run the camp, Cabin 14 had never once been fully occupied overnight without something happening. Windows found cracked open in the dead heat of summer when nobody had touched them. Bunks discovered rearranged by morning with no explanation. One counselor, years before either of us worked there, who refused to describe what she'd seen and quit outright that same week, no notice given. That same afternoon, before I went looking for answers on my own, I sat down separately with each of the 8 boys and had them describe what they'd seen, one at a time, without letting them talk to each other first. I wanted to see if the stories would fall apart under a little scrutiny, the way kids' stories usually do once you start asking specifics. They didn't. Every single one of them, independently, described the same height, the same low counting voice, the same detail about it pausing longest at Miles's bunk. One of the quieter boys, a kid named Toby who hadn't said much of anything the whole session, added something none of the others had mentioned. He said that right before the figure turned to leave, it had said a name, quiet, almost under its breath, and that the name wasn't any of theirs. He couldn't remember it exactly, only that it started with a W, and it had struck him as an old-fashioned kind of name, not something any 12-year-old in that cabin was called. I didn't think much of that detail until later that evening, when Deacon and I compared notes and realized he'd heard something similar from 2 of the other boys separately, a fragment of a name they couldn't fully place either, but that one of them was almost positive started the same way. That same afternoon, on a hunch, I drove into town and spent an hour at the little public library looking through old local newspaper archives on microfilm, something I hadn't done since a school project years earlier. I found a short article from decades back, barely 4 paragraphs, about a camp counselor named Wendell A., last name abbreviated the way small local papers sometimes did back then, who had died of what the article vaguely called an accident on camp grounds during a summer session. No further detail was given about what kind of accident, no mention of which cabin, nothing beyond a sentence noting that the camp had closed early that year, out of respect for the family. I sat there in the library for a long moment after reading it, thinking about a boy telling me a counting voice had said a name starting with W the night before, in a cabin I hadn't yet connected to any name at all. I didn't tell the director I'd gone looking, and I didn't tell Deacon what the newspaper had said either, not that summer. I'm still not sure why, except that saying it out loud felt like it would make it more real than I was ready for it to be. I did go back to the library microfilm one more time before the session ended, trying to find anything more specific about how Wendell had died, and came up with nothing beyond that same short article, reprinted almost word for word a week later as a small notice thanking the community for their support during a difficult time. Whatever had actually happened in that cabin, the camp had clearly worked hard, even back then, to keep it contained to 4 vague paragraphs and nothing more. We kept all 8 boys out of 14 for the rest of that session, splitting them between 2 other already full cabins instead. A few days later, still bothered by the whole thing, I decided to go back into 14 myself, alone, during broad daylight, just to prove to myself there had to be some kind of rational explanation. Mice in the walls. An old draft catching a window latch. Something ordinary I could point to and feel better about. I counted the bunks out of pure habit the second I stepped through the door. 8. I counted again, slower, just to be sure. 9. I want to be able to tell you that I found something explainable. An old folded cot leaned up against the far wall that I'd simply miscounted the first pass through. I didn't. There were 9 full bunk frames bolted directly into that cabin's floor, and when I went and checked the camp's own supply and maintenance records afterward, only 8 had ever been ordered or installed for that specific building, going all the way back to when the camp was first built decades earlier. Maintenance had no record whatsoever of ever installing a 9th. The director himself had never once noticed it in 15 years of walking through that cabin. When I brought him back in to see it for himself, he went visibly pale, told me to leave it exactly as it was and not to touch it again, and locked the cabin back up that same afternoon. As far as I know, Cabin 14 has stayed locked ever since, and every counselor who's worked there since that summer has heard some version of this story from somebody, whether the camp director wanted them to or not. I've always been the kind of person who needs a rational explanation for everything, no exceptions. Growing up, my dad used to tease me about it constantly, said I'd argue with a ghost about its own paperwork before I'd ever admit it was real. That particular part of my personality got tested harder than it ever had before, about 2 years ago, right after I moved in with my boyfriend Bryce. He'd already been renting an old 2-story farmhouse outside Boone for close to a year by the time I moved in, at the end of a long gravel drive with more land around it than either of us really knew what to do with. It was beautiful in that worn-in, honest, mountain kind of way, and I fell for the place the same afternoon I first walked through it. Bryce had mentioned once, early on, that the previous tenant had moved out only 4 months into a year-long lease and forfeited the deposit rather than stay. But he'd shrugged it off as probably just somebody who didn't like the commute, and I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. There was a hallway connecting our bedroom to the guest room down the hall, no windows anywhere along it, just a single bare bulb at the far end that Bryce always said he meant to replace and somehow never got around to. I hated walking down that hallway at night from almost the very beginning, and for a long time I told myself it was just because it was dark and unfamiliar, ordinary new house nerves that would fade with time the way they usually do. In those first few weeks, before anything had actually happened, I noticed small things I didn't think much of at the time, the kind of details you only remember later once you have a reason to go looking back through them. The thermostat in the hallway would sometimes read a few degrees colder than the rest of the house, even with the heat running evenly through every vent. Our dog, a normally fearless little terrier mix, refused outright to walk down that hallway on her own, always hanging back at the corner until one of us carried her past it. I mentioned it to Bryce once, half joking, and he just shrugged and said, "Old houses settle strangely, get colder in some spots than others, nothing more to it than that." I wanted to believe him. For a while, I mostly did. About a month after I'd fully moved in, I woke up around 3 in the morning needing water, and I stood in our bedroom doorway looking down that hallway toward the kitchen, and there was someone standing at the far end of it, right in front of the closed guest room door, facing away from me completely still. I remember thinking, very calmly and very clearly, "That's not Bryce," because I could hear him breathing steadily behind me in bed the whole time. I didn't scream. I just said, "Hey, quiet, almost stupid, the way you'd talk to a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong yard by mistake." Whoever it was didn't turn around, didn't respond at all. After a few seconds, they simply weren't there anymore. Not a dramatic movement, not a sound, just gone, like a light going out. I woke Bryce up right away and told him everything. He checked the guest room himself, found the window locked, nothing disturbed inside, nothing out of place anywhere. He told me I'd probably still been half asleep and had dreamed the whole thing, and honestly, I wanted so badly to believe him because the alternative felt like more than I knew how to carry. Still, that night, I noticed something small I didn't mention to him right away. An old framed photograph that had always hung crooked on the guest room wall, one Bryce said had come with the house and he'd just never bothered taking down, was now hanging perfectly straight. About 2 weeks later it happened again, except this time Bryce saw it too. We were both already fully awake, both standing together in the hallway checking on a noise we'd heard from the kitchen, and we watched the exact same shape appear near that same dim spot by the bulb, where the light never quite reached the corners. Neither of us moved for what felt like a full minute. Then it was simply gone again, the same way, no sound, no explanation, nothing left behind to prove either of us hadn't just imagined the entire thing together somehow. Bryce didn't say a word the rest of that night. In the morning, he admitted he'd heard footsteps in that hallway a handful of times before I ever moved in, always late, always just once, and had talked himself out of it every single time, the same way I'd been trying to talk myself out of it now. We didn't go back to sleep that night. In the morning, Bryce called the man we rented from, an older guy named Holt, whose family had owned that house for 3 generations before him, and asked carefully if anything unusual had ever happened there that he knew of. Holt went quiet on the phone in that specific way people do right before they decide to tell you something they'd honestly rather not. He said his uncle had lived in that house alone for the last 20 years of his life, and that toward the end of it, his uncle had stopped using the guest room entirely, sleeping instead on the living room couch most nights. Bryce asked why. Holt said his uncle used to tell him the hallway just didn't feel right after dark, and that he'd always figured it was simply old man stuff, nothing worth passing along to a new tenant. Before we let him go, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked Holt if his uncle had ever said who or what he thought it actually was in that hallway. Holt hesitated for a long moment, then said his uncle used to claim it was a hired hand who'd worked the property back in the 50s, a man who'd gone missing one winter during a bad storm and was never found, presumed to have frozen somewhere out on the land, though nobody ever located a body despite weeks of searching at the time. The family had always just assumed he'd wandered off the property entirely and died somewhere past the tree line, eventually calling off the search when the weather turned worse. Holt said his uncle used to leave the porch light on every single night for years afterward, so the man could find his way back if he was still out there somewhere, which Holt had always chalked up to an old man's guilt or grief more than anything literal. A few days after that call, while I was clearing out an old chest of drawers in the guest room to start packing, I found something wedged into the back of the bottom drawer behind the liner paper, like it had slipped down there years ago and never been noticed. It was a small leather work glove, cracked and stiff with age, the kind you'd wear doing farm labor, sized for a man's hand. There was no matching glove anywhere else in the room, no explanation for how it had ended up in a drawer in a house that had supposedly been thoroughly cleaned out and re-rented multiple times since Holt's uncle passed. I didn't tell Bryce right away. I just held on to it for a minute, standing there in that room, feeling colder than the weather outside accounted for, before I finally called him in to see it. He didn't say much when I showed him. He just took it from me, turned it over once, and set it down on the dresser like he didn't want to be holding it any more than he had to. Neither of us said the word out loud, but I know we were both thinking the same thing, that we were looking at something that might have belonged to the man Holt's uncle used to leave the porch light on for. We asked Holt if we could break the lease early. He didn't push back on it at all, which honestly told me more than anything he'd actually said out loud on that call. He let us out with 30 days notice and no penalty whatsoever, almost like some part of him had already been expecting that exact phone call for longer than he'd probably admit. In the last week before we moved out, I woke up one more time in the middle of the night, and this time I didn't get up right away. I just lay there listening, and I could hear something moving slowly down that hallway toward the guest room, footsteps that sounded heavier than they should have been on old wood, pausing every few steps the way a person does when they're favoring an injury or just moving carefully in the dark. I never opened the door that night. I never looked. I just listened until the footsteps stopped somewhere near the guest room, and then didn't hear anything else at all for the rest of the night. In the morning, the glove I'd left sitting on the dresser was gone. We searched that entire room and never found it again, not in any drawer, not under the bed, not anywhere. Bryce still says he thinks I must have thrown it out without remembering, which I understand, because it's the only version of that morning that doesn't scare him. We moved that spring into a one-story place where I can see the full length of every hallway from any doorway in the house, and I sleep noticeably better for it. Bryce and I don't talk about that old farmhouse much anymore, not even with each other. But last winter, going through a box of things from the move, I found a photo Bryce had taken of the guest room during our very first week living there, before we'd even unpacked anything, just meant to send to his mom to show her the space. In the corner of that photo, reflected faintly in the window glass behind where he'd been standing to take it, there's a shape in the hallway, facing the camera directly. Bryce swears, every time I bring it up, that he was completely alone in that house the entire day he took it. I've thought a lot about why that house let us go so easily, if that's even the right way to put it. Holt never fought the lease. The footsteps, as far as I know, never came back once we'd already decided to leave. It's almost like whatever was in that hallway only wanted us to know it was there, not to keep us, and once we understood that, there was nothing left for it to do. I don't know if that theory holds up to any kind of scrutiny. My dad would probably still tell me to find a better explanation. I haven't managed to yet. When I was 11 years old, my best friend was a kid named Deacon Cole, who lived 2 houses down from me in a little town tucked into the hills of West Virginia that most people driving through never even bothered to remember the name of afterward. His dad ran some kind of business out of their basement, something involving old electronics and repair work, though nobody in the whole neighborhood could ever tell you exactly what it actually was, only that a plain white van came and went from the driveway at odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes before sunrise. Deacon and I hung out together most days after school, but here's the thing I didn't think much about at the time, looking back on it now. He never once invited me over to his house unless his dad's truck was already gone from the driveway first. I just figured that was some kind of family rule, the same way my own house had rules about video games on school nights, nothing worth questioning at that age. His mom was always kind to me on the rare occasions I saw her, a little tired looking, quick to change the subject anytime Deacon's dad came up in conversation. One Saturday, his dad's schedule changed at the last minute, and I ended up over there anyway, which had genuinely never happened before in the whole time we'd been friends. His dad seemed friendly enough on the surface, in a way that felt slightly rehearsed, like a man reciting the lines of someone friendly rather than actually being it deep down. He told us to stay upstairs and to stay completely out of the basement, Said he kept sensitive equipment down there that wasn't safe to be around. Deacon just nodded along like he'd heard that exact line 100 times before and stopped questioning it a long time ago. At dinner that night, his dad asked me a lot of questions I thought were just normal grown-up small talk at the time. What street I lived on exactly, what time my parents usually got home from work, whether I had any siblings who might come looking for me if I stayed out late. I answered all of it without thinking twice. That night, after his dad went up to bed, I heard somebody moving around downstairs. Deacon was already fast asleep beside me on the floor. I crept to the top of the basement stairs, and the door, which was always kept firmly shut during the daytime, was cracked open just slightly. I could hear a low humming sound drifting up from below, and underneath that hum, something that took me a long time afterward to admit sounded like a voice, muffled almost completely, repeating the same handful of words over and over that I couldn't quite make out no matter how hard I strained to listen. I stood there long enough that my legs started to ache before I finally made myself go back to bed. I told Deacon about it first thing the next morning, and he got noticeably quiet, told me flatly that I shouldn't have been listening at all. When I pushed him further on it, he finally admitted, almost reluctantly, that his dad kept a locked room built into the back of the basement, behind the old furnace, that even he himself had never once been allowed inside in his whole life. I asked him what was actually in there. He said he honestly didn't know for sure, that his dad always just said it was dangerous and left it completely at that, no further explanation ever offered, and that once, years earlier, he'd asked his mom about it and she'd told him never to bring it up around his father again. I was 11 years old and had exactly zero good judgment to speak of, so I spent the next week talking Deacon into looking. Just once, the following Saturday, his dad was scheduled to be gone for the entire day running errands. We went down there together while his mom was distracted upstairs, and behind that furnace, exactly where he'd said it would be, was a plain door with a padlock hanging on it, and right beside that door, low down near the floor, a small metal ventilation grate cut into the wall, half hidden behind a stack of old cardboard boxes that looked like they'd been pushed there on purpose. I crouched down and looked through the grate. It was dark inside that room, but there was just enough light bleeding in from somewhere to make out rough shapes. A narrow cot pushed against one wall, a folding metal chair, and pinned up in neat, careful rows across the opposite wall, dozens of photographs, all of them showing more or less the same thing from slightly different angles. Our own street, our own houses, taken from what looked like ground level, like whoever had taken them had been crouched low in somebody's yard at the time, hidden. One of those photographs was of my own front porch. I recognized the chipped paint on our railing before I even fully registered anything else in the frame around it. Beside the photographs, taped in a lower row, were several torn pages that looked like they'd been pulled out of a school directory, names and addresses circled in red pen, some crossed out entirely, others left untouched. I scanned as many of the names as I could in the few seconds I let myself keep looking, and even at 11 years old, panicking, half of what I registered was just recognizing kids from my own grade, faces I passed in the hallway every single day without a second thought. I didn't understand yet what any of it meant. I just understood, in some animal part of my brain, that I needed to not be looking at it anymore, and that I needed to get Deacon and get out of that basement before his dad's truck came back up the driveway. I don't remember making any kind of decision to run. I just remember being outside all of a sudden, and then being home, telling my parents enough of what I'd seen, though not quite all of it, to make my dad go visibly pale and immediately pick up the phone. 2 police officers came out to our house that same evening and talked with him in low, careful voices in the kitchen, while I sat in the next room, not really supposed to be listening, but listening anyway. I caught a few words here and there, enough to know they were asking my dad whether I'd be willing to describe what I saw again for an actual detective, and enough to know from his tone that he didn't want that to happen if he could help it. Later that night, after the officers had gone, I overheard my dad on the phone with our neighbor across the street, the Hendersons, telling them to check on their own kids and to keep an eye on anything unusual for a while, without explaining exactly why. Careful in the way adults get when they don't want to start a panic, but also don't want to say nothing at all. I found out years later that at least 2 other families on our street got similar calls that same night, quiet warnings passed house to house without ever officially becoming public knowledge, the kind of thing a small town handles on its own instead of letting it become a story people outside the neighborhood ever hear about. I never went back to Deacon's house again after that day. Within 2 weeks, the entire family had moved out with no warning to anybody on the street, moving truck gone from the driveway before most of the neighbors had even fully noticed it had shown up in the first place. Deacon never came back to school afterward. I asked around about him for years, on and off, and nobody ever had a real answer for me. Not the school administration, not the other neighbors, not even the local police when my dad tried following up on it much later, who only told him the matter had been handled and offered nothing further beyond that single word. Years later, well into my 20s, I did try looking Deacon up online myself, mostly out of a curiosity I couldn't quite shake even after all that time. I never found him under that name, no social media, no public record of any kind that I could locate, almost like the family had scrubbed themselves off the map entirely after leaving that town. What I did find, buried in an old regional news archive, was a short article from about a year after they'd moved, mentioning that a man matching his father's general description had been questioned in a completely different state in connection with a string of unsolved disappearances involving children, though no charges were ever filed and the article never named him directly. I have no way of knowing for certain if it was really him. The description in that article was vague enough to fit a lot of men: height, build, general age range, nothing that would hold up as identification on its own. But it was specific enough about the timeline, about a family that had relocated abruptly from a small town in the same general region only months earlier, that I've never quite been able to convince myself it was a coincidence either. I reached out once, years ago, to a local reporter who still had a byline at that same regional paper, asking if there was any more detail available beyond what had been published. She wrote back a single line saying the case file had been sealed and she couldn't discuss it further, which told me less than nothing and also told me everything at the same time. I've never been able to stop wondering, and I've never been able to fully let it go, even now, with a family and a life of my own that has nothing to do with any of it anymore. I think about that grate more than I'd probably like to admit, even now, as an adult. Not just the photographs, though those still surface in my head sometimes without warning, usually late at night for no particular reason. What I think about most, more than anything else, is that on a small ledge just inside that locked door, right next to the cot, there was a second padlock, smaller than the one on the outside, already open, hanging loose from a hasp bolted straight into the floor. Like whatever that second lock had originally been built to hold in place had, at some point before I ever crouched down and looked through that grate myself, already found some way to get out.